It is the night of the 4th of February 1945, somewhere above the black water of the Heligoland Bight. A twin-engined aircraft drops down out of a cloud layer, engines throttled back until they are barely a murmur against the wind. Below, invisible in the dark, lies the narrow ribbon of the Kiel Canal, the artery that lets German shipping slip between the Baltic and the North Sea, without ever running the gauntlet of the Royal Navy. The pilot checks his airspeed, checks his height, checks it again. In the bomb bay behind him sits a single cylindrical object, roughly the size of a large dustbin, packed with explosive and a delicate parachute rig. There is no dramatic whistle, no flash, no roar. The object drops away, the parachute cracks open, and it settles into the water with barely a splash anyone on the bank would notice. The aircraft climbs away into the dark and is gone. Nothing has exploded. Nothing appears to have happened at all. And that precisely is the point. This was gardening, the RAF's own quietly domestic code name for aerial mine laying, and the men who flew it called dropping a mine, planting a vegetable. It sounds almost comic until you understand what it achieved. A single de Havilland Mosquito, flown low and fast and largely unseen, could plant a weapon in enemy waters that might sit inert for days, weeks, or months waiting. It required no target to be visible, no bombs to land precisely on a ship, no risk of a pitched battle. It simply had to be there, hidden, patient, indistinguishable from the mud and silt of the canal bed. And in doing so, quietly, unglamorously, night after night, it choked one of the most important waterways in Hitler's war machine. And it did so almost without the enemy ever being certain where the danger lay. This matters because the Kiel Canal was not just another stretch of water. It was the pressure valve that let the German Navy move ships, submarines, and material between two seas without exposing them to British interception in open water. Close that valve, even partially, even unpredictably, and you did not just sink ships. You forced an entire war machine to second-guess every movement it made. To understand why the British turned to something as unglamorous as underwater mines dropped by aircraft, you have to understand the problem the Royal Navy and the RAF were wrestling with from the earliest months of the war. Germany's geography gave it an enormous strategic advantage. The Kiel Canal, cut through the base of the Jutland Peninsula in the previous century, allowed the Kriegsmarine to shift vessels, including U-boats, from the Baltic shipyards where so many were built, into the North Sea and onward to the Atlantic, without those vessels ever having to sail the long way round Denmark, through waters where British submarines and aircraft were waiting. For Britain, an island nation utterly dependent on the safe passage of merchant convoys, the U-boat was the single greatest threat to national survival, and the canal was the shortcut that let those U-boats reach the killing grounds of the Atlantic faster and more safely than any other route. Conventional bombing couldn't solve this problem easily. The canal itself was a difficult target, a long, narrow strip of water running through farmland, with locks and embankments that needed to be hit with real precision if a raid was to do lasting damage. And even a breached bank could often be patched by German engineers within days. Early attempts to destroy the canal outright, including a costly daylight raid in September 1939 that cost Bomber Command several aircraft for a return that did not close the waterway for long, made painfully clear that trying to simply blow the canal apart from the air was neither easy nor reliably decisive. Meanwhile, surface mine layers, ships of the Royal Navy tasked with laying mines in German coastal waters, were slow, vulnerable, and could rarely get close enough to the most valuable stretches of water without running into German patrols, minesweepers, or shore batteries. A destroyer or mine layer that could carry a useful number of mines might take the better part of a day or more to reach the operational area, all the while exposed to attack, whereas a fast aircraft could cover the same distance and return home before dawn, again and again, night after night. What was needed then was something that combined the reach and speed of an aircraft with the psychological and physical menace of a naval mine, a weapon that could be delivered accurately into a narrow channel that would remain concealed on the seabed or in the water column, and that German minesweepers would struggle to detect, let alone clear, without slowing their own shipping to a crawl. It had to be light enough for an aircraft to carry a useful load, robust enough to survive being dropped from height into water, and sensitive enough to trigger against a passing hull without also destroying itself uselessly against every ripple and eddy. On paper, it sounded almost impossible. A mine clever enough to distinguish a warship from the wash of the tide, delivered by an aircraft small enough to slip through German air defenses almost unnoticed. The organizations that took on this challenge were the Admiralty's mine design establishments working alongside the Royal Air Force, most notably the Mining Research Establishment at Havant and the RAF's bomber command squadrons, who would actually deliver the weapons. Between them, they refined a family of aerial mines, airdropped versions of magnetic and acoustic ground mines that had already proven their worth in coastal waters, adapted so that a standard bomber and, crucially, the fast wooden-framed de Havilland Mosquito could carry and release them accurately at low level. The technical trick was deceptively simple in concept. Rather than relying on a ship physically striking the mine, as with the moored contact mines of the previous war, these were ground mines that settled on the bed of the shallow canal and its approaches, and detected the disturbance a large steel hull created as it passed overhead, either through changes in the local magnetic field or through the low-frequency rumble of its engines and propellers traveling through the water. Imagine a heavy dustbin lid resting on a doorstep, wired so that it only reacts to the specific tread of a particular kind of boot. That was roughly the principle at work, tuned to ignore the general churn of the canal, but to answer to the unmistakable signature of several thousand tons of steel warship gliding overhead. Each mine typically weighed several hundred kilograms, was a little under 2 meters long, and was fitted with a parachute so that, dropped from a Mosquito skimming in at a few hundred feet, it would enter the water gently enough not to detonate itself or be damaged on impact, and sink quietly to the bottom of the canal to wait. Because the canal was narrow, often no more than 100 or so meters across in places, and lined with locks that funneled every vessel through fixed points, a relatively small number of mines, placed with care, could threaten a disproportionately large volume of traffic. Records of exact production numbers for these aerial ground mines remain incomplete, and some figures were never fully declassified, but historians estimate that the RAF laid many thousands of mines around German-controlled waters over the course of the war, with the Kiel Canal and its approaches, together with the Elbe estuary and the waters around the Frisian Islands, treated as priority targets from 1940 onward, and again with renewed intensity in the final year of the war, as the RAF sought to strangle what remained of German seaborne traffic. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Mosquito itself was central to making this campaign practical rather than theoretical. Built largely of wood at a time when aluminium was in desperately short supply, and capable of flying faster than many of the fighters sent up to intercept it, the Mosquito could dash across the North Sea at low level, drop its mine with precision navigation, and be home before German night fighters had properly worked out where it had been. Squadrons such as 105 and 139, and later dedicated mining units, flew these low-level sorties against the canal and its surrounding waters through 1944 and into 1945, often in poor winter weather that grounded heavier, slower aircraft but suited the Mosquito's speed and agility rather well. The operational effect, though hard to quantify with precision, because so much of the German response was deliberately concealed from public record, was significant and cumulative rather than dramatic. Reports gathered by British intelligence, often pieced together from neutral shipping agents and sparse German press coverage, suggested that, by the middle of the war, a steady toll of vessels, including at least a handful of minesweepers sent in specifically to clear these hidden threats, were being damaged or sunk in the canal and its approaches. Perhaps more damaging than any single sinking was the effect on confidence. On occasion, the canal was closed altogether to neutral shipping. Insurance rates for vessels bound for German ports rose sharply, and at least one Scandinavian shipping line reportedly suspended its routes to Germany entirely, rather than risk the crossing. German minesweeping flotillas were forced to spend days at a time sweeping stretches of water that may or may not have contained live mines, tying up manpower and vessels that could otherwise have been used elsewhere, and slowing the very traffic the canal was meant to speed up. Set against Germany's own efforts, the contrast is instructive. The Kriegsmarine possessed capable magnetic and acoustic mines of its own, and used them extensively against British coastal waters and convoy routes, particularly in the opening years of the war. But German aerial mining never achieved the same sustained precision character against a single strategic choke point that the RAF's campaign against the Kiel Canal did. The United States, for its part, would go on to conduct a vastly larger aerial mining campaign later in the war, most famously against Japan in Operation Starvation, dropping tens of thousands of mines to blockade the home islands, a campaign that owed a considerable conceptual debt to the smaller-scale earlier lessons learned by the RAF over German waters. Where the British effort against the canal differed was in its scale of ambition relative to available resources. A comparatively modest number of aircraft and mines applied with real precision against a single, narrow, unavoidable bottleneck, rather than a mass campaign against dispersed coastal shipping. Assessing the true historical impact of the canal mining campaign requires some honesty about the limits of the surviving record. Exact figures for ships sunk or damaged specifically within the canal, as opposed to its wider approaches, are incomplete, and wartime secrecy on both sides means some outcomes were never fully documented. What can be said with confidence is that the campaign forced Germany to divert real resources, minesweepers, personnel, and time to a threat that could never be fully neutralized, because a channel swept clear one day might have a fresh mine planted the next night by an aircraft that had come and gone before anyone on the ground even registered the engine note overhead. The psychological toll, the simple uncertainty of never quite knowing whether a stretch of water believed safe genuinely was, may in the end have mattered as much as any single sinking. The technique also fed directly into post-war naval thinking about the vulnerability of choke points and canals to precisely this kind of low-cost, high-uncertainty denial, an idea that would echo through Cold War planning and beyond. A handful of preserved examples of RAF aerial ground mines survive today in museum collections, including the Fleet Air Arm Museum and the RAF Museum. Quiet metal cylinders that give little hint, on their own, of the disproportionate anxiety they once caused an entire naval command. Return for a moment to that Mosquito climbing away into the dark over the Heligoland Bight. Engines opening up now that the job is done. The pilot glancing back at black water that looks, to any casual observer, exactly as it did 5 minutes before. No flash, no column of smoke, no confirmation. That night, or perhaps ever, that the weapon just left behind will do its work. That absence of drama was not a failure of the mission. It was the mission. The entire value of the aerial mine lay in what it did not announce. It did not need to sink a ship that same night or that same week to succeed. It needed only to exist, silently, in a place where the enemy could never quite be sure it wasn't there. Britain never closed the Kiel Canal with a single dramatic strike, the way a tallboy bomb famously breached its banks in September 1944. What gardening achieved instead was quieter and, in its way, more corrosive. A persistent, gnawing uncertainty that turned a vital strategic shortcut into a gamble every German captain had to take on faith. Ships were delayed, minesweepers were exhausted, insurance premiums climbed. Neutral shipping lines simply gave up and went elsewhere. None of it made headlines at the time because none of it was meant to. It was a war fought in silence, waged by men flying wooden aircraft at treetop height across a freezing sea, planting weapons that asked for nothing but patience. That, in the end, is the story worth remembering. Not an explosion, not a single decisive battle, but a slow strangulation carried out mine by mine, sortie by sortie, garden by garden, until one of Hitler's most valuable waterways became a place his own navy no longer entirely trusted. The RAF never needed the Kiel Canal to explode. They only needed the Kriegsmarine to wonder if it might.